Don't put your yield at risk, put your trust in proven solutions. Anvil Nitrogen Stabilizer, Super U Premium Fertilizer, and Tribune Nitrogen Stabilizer from Koch Agronomic Services. These products offer higher active ingredient concentrations imitator brands can't match. See the difference at defendyourn.ca.
Okay, let's talk about a topic that nobody has any opinion about. Haha, that was sarcasm. It is, how do we fund variety development going forward? Well, we're going to chat about it with two very familiar names here on Real Ag Radio. Up first, we've got Lauren Comin, who is Director of Policy with Seeds Canada. Lauren, it's great to chat with you.
Great to chat with you as well, Sean.
And we've also got here the Managing Director of CAPI. You hear him all the time on the Friday show. It is Tyler McCann. Tyler, how are we doing?
I'm doing well, Sean. Great to be talking about plant breeding with you today.
Yeah, and I was saying there is some pretty strong opinions when it comes to the future. Well, the current state of plant breeding in the country, but also what does the future look like? And obviously, we don't know our political future, which is a variable on this topic indeed, but shouldn't stop us from sort of pondering what the future could look like, especially for our public plant breeding institution or system, and how that works in combination or in competition, depending on how you look at it, with the private sector. So, Lauren, we've got an opinion column that the two of you co-wrote talking about this topic. I guess set the stage for us and how we should be thinking about it.
So it's it's hard for me to be brief at the best of times, especially for a subject where, I've been so focused on for over a decade, but try to give the Coles notes here. We have a crisis that's been brewing in terms of variety development and plant breeding in Canada, especially of small grains, cereals, pulses, etc. And it's been discussed for several decades now, and we've had ebbs and flows, and there's sort of been peaks in terms of the crisis level, but we haven't really come to a resolution in those decades, and now we're at a point where we're really starting to see some of the changes that have been made have an impact in the number of varieties that farmers are seeing, and the quality of those varieties. We're having, a government that's had its budgets reduced a number of times, and we have political uncertainty right now. We don't know which party will form government in just under a month here. And depending on which party, and I think regardless of the party, we're going to see cuts. And how big are those cuts going to be? And looking at all the priorities that the government has and everything that's been going on in the world over the last 5 years and everything that's going on today, it's really difficult to see public plant breeding funding being a priority for this government. And certainly, not just the funding, but the actual action of doing the research, the performance of the research. So we're sort of at a point here where the industry together, so that's farmers, that's AAFC, that's all of the actors in the breeding sector and private industry, need to come together to figure out how we're going to move forward. And it's gotten to the point, I would say, where it's urgent. And a lot of the things that have been done, policies that have been taken in recent years, have not necessarily been conducive to getting us to the place where we need to be to safeguard plant breeding in Canada.
And so what I'm kind of hearing here is we have two things happening. We have let's just cereals. In cereals, we have low certified seed use. And around say 20%, 18, 20%, depending. And it depends by crop type. It can year to year, but let's just say 20% for easy math. And we've got cutbacks happening in the federal government side to the breeding programs. Plus, on top of that, we've had, when I say we, I mean just the country as a whole, as a stakeholder, has a hard time recruiting, securing private investment to come into this market. One, low certified seed use, and not exactly a way to, like, a path to a profitable program. And so if you don't have profits, it's hard to attract private investment. Is that kind of the summation of those two things working against each other, kind of?
Yes, so absolutely. So in a lot of jurisdictions, they do have a healthy private sector. And the reason we don't have that in Canada, well, there's several reasons. The first is we have this dominant public sector that is competing and takes up the majority of market share, again, depending on crop, depending on class. But our intellectual property legislation is also considered very weak in comparison to similar, competitive jurisdictions. And that is because while we do have the ability to collect for rights holders to collect royalties on the use of farm safe seed, that's not enshrined in our legislation. So there's no requirement for farmers to remit remuneration for farm safe seed use. And our ability, the private sector's ability to enforce is also very, very weak. Over the last decade, we've had a number of conversations about a royalty model for farm safe seed use to recognize that when farmers are using farm safe seed, they're still using that innovation package and benefiting from that innovation package that they purchased when they purchased the certified seed. So we've had a number of consultations and discussions about how do we recognize that value. And, the last one ended in 2020, right before the world closed down there in March. And it was a failure, to put it, bluntly. And, the private sector still didn't have a way of collecting on the use of their intellectual property. So the private sector did work together to establish the Variety Use Agreement, or VUA, which is an example of a trailing royalty. It's a contract-based system. It's, up to the farmer to decide that they see value in that variety and choose to purchase a variety in the VUA program. But it's really had limited success, and one of the biggest reasons there is that AAFC has intentionally kept their varieties out of the platform, meaning that private industry and other players, public players even, don't have that option to compete on a level playing ground.
No, Tyler, I think I have a pretty good read on the audience there, and some are going to be very supportive of what is being suggested here needs to change. And some are going to have some pretty strong pushback. And the pushback is going to be, wait a minute here. So if there's going to be a VUA I'm going to pay a royalty on the certified seed, and then I'm also going to pay a VUA on my farm safe seed, which is, my right to use that farm safe seed. And I'm, maybe potentially, putting in checkoff dollars. Like, I feel like I'm paying double, triple. I keep on, I'm paying. And so I want you to address that side of it, because the audience is going to be screaming at their radios right now.
Yeah, and so Sean, I think it's an important kind of concept that if Canadian farmers want to be treated often the way farmers are in the rest of the world, they should only pay for their seed. The farmers should have that relationship with the plant breeder. And so every time the farmer uses the variety developed by a plant breeder, the farmer pays the variety developer, whether or not it's a public or private breeder, that royalty. That should be the simple relationship. That is the most effective way for farmers to make sure that their dollars that they're spending on new plant genetics go back to the seed. And the VUA is a mechanism. I think, Sean, one of the things that in the past has been an issue is we've thought about a VUA as kind of a revolution in plant breeding, or the way that things are done. And I think that we need to kind of change the way we think about this, that this is a small step forward to more sustainable breeding programs in this country. This isn't kind of a step towards private plant breeding. I think that this is a step towards saving the public breeding programs at the end of the day. And if we want to make sure that the public plant breeders, that the farmers' values stay in the business, making sure that they're rewarded as well for when farmers use their varieties is an absolute piece of that and core of that. And at the end of the day, if that means that some of those checkoff dollars that are going into plant breeding today can go into things like agronomic research or other value added use, that's really something that we should be rewarding and encouraging. And Lauren talked about this crisis in plant breeding. I don't think it's just a crisis in plant breeding. The more work that we do on R&D in Canada, the clearer it comes across the innovation continuum, from that basic research to applied research, commercialization and development. We are struggling in this country, and so we need to find better ways to make sure that that innovation work, that R&D is rewarded. And I think a VUA is a simple, effective way for farmers to do that for those that are developing the varieties, whether they're public or private at the end of the day.
Okay, so you're suggesting that a VUA, no matter how, on the use of that seed throughout the years, could potentially save public plant breeding. I can get my head wrapped around that. That makes some sense to me. Again, I'll be devil's advocate. If public plant breeding needed saving, why hasn't public plant breeding said, hey, VUA, perfect, here's a system I can use, and they went a different direction? But are you trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist?
I think that the governments have certainly looked at this over years, and but they're also sensitive to the broader political environment and the pushback. And we know that Lauren talked about kind of the failed exercise in 2020. That did not end well. And I think it made everybody that's involved in this topic very shy. And again, my disclosure is at that time, I was working in part at Seeds Canada. Lauren was working for Alberta Wheat at the time on the producer side of this. I think it gives us a pretty good perspective on all of the different sides of this and how this plays out. And so we saw that experience end badly for everybody that's involved. We saw Ag Canada pull back. But I think if, let's be honest, I think those that are trying to run those breeding programs inside Agriculture Canada will be the biggest winners of this if we move forward with it today. They're the ones that need the resources invested back in their breeding programs in ways that's not happening today.
Is this suggestion, are these monies on top of what crop commissions are already putting into the programs? Lauren or Tyler?
Yeah, I think, I think it really depends on what producers are looking for. I think producers and the government have gotten so entrenched in this system of funding where they have layers on layers, and there's the cluster programs, and there's core agreements, and there's project funds, and there's budget dollars that go in. And every contract and agreement has a different timeline. So you just sort of layer things on top of each other. And it's been so difficult to get out of that. But when you have that money that's going around the system, it's not very direct, and you lose a lot of efficiency. So, I think that the most direct way for farmers to set the priorities for plant breeding and to say, I see value in this particular breeding program, is to pay directly for the varieties that they're purchasing from that breeding program through a VUA. Now, whether or not that is in addition to commission funds is a question for commissions. But I mean, what I would suggest, and obviously I don't work with commission dollars anymore, is that, over time there could be a transition where if AAFC wants to remain in variety development, and, they've indicated that they would like to transition more upstream, but that's not for all crops, then they could fund that variety development with dollars from the VUA, just like every other program. And if producers want to fund more upstream work, certainly agronomy and other work that AAFC wants to do, then that is a role for checkoff dollars. Checkoff dollars, should be going towards more public good work, along with matching with government dollars. So certainly the VUA can over time replace funds that are going towards variety development. But they can also, leverage funds and grow programs. So that's really up to how producers, see their future.
Tyler, have you worked out the math in terms of what is the shortfall required to make the public plant breeding machine in Canada fully funded or have adequate funding to be able to compete against, over the long term? And how does that work back to what the VUA needs to be?
Sean, one of the problems that we have today is that we don't actually have a lot of insight into how much Canada and the other public breeders spend on their breeding programs. I wish we could do that math, but we don't have that today. What we have is some math around how much Canada could have gotten had there been a VUA on public varieties that have been released. It's a bit of a sense as to kind of how much money would be changing hands between the farmers that are using those varieties and the breeders that are developing them. And again, I think it is important that ultimately, I think when we think about the future, what should matter to farmers in Western Canada is, can they get access to varieties that are better and better year over year and reliably know that there's plant breeders in this country working on producing the new, better, more efficient, more productive, more disease-resistant varieties. And that should be the number one goal and outcome. And I think often we don't talk about what we need. We need new varieties. We need better varieties. And a VUA can help make sure farmers get that.
I think the best case scenario, however we get there, best case scenario is a healthy public system, a very healthy private plant breeding, competitors there, and they're competing and they're holding each other in check. They're also collaborating. It's another thing that's like the best case. The worst case is I would say this is kind of feel like sort of the path that we're on, where I sort of alluded to this at the beginning, which is where we've got a diminishing, a slow burn on the end of the public system. And the private system's like, Canada, not for me, because there's just not an opportunity over the love of the acre amounts. Like, who doesn't want to try to compete for, a 22 million acre market of wheat, for example? And then at the end of the day, we end up with kind of nothing. That's the worst case scenario, Lauren.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, despite the fact that AEFC has been saying for over 10 years and has included it in their science strategy that they want to build capacity in the private sector, we are so dangerously close to that point where we have no private breeding, especially in cereals in Canada. And I don't know if everyone realizes just how close we are to having absolutely no capacity. So, despite the plan to build capacity, the policies and the actions are not there. And that's, having one supplier of varieties, whether or not it's a public system, is not good for farmers. Competition is healthy. And I think the majority of farmers, I've never heard a farmer say that competition wasn't ideal and that they don't want choice. But they are so dangerously close to that point. And, the way the breeding pipeline works, it is a long-term game. They may see varieties coming out yearly. You may get 4 or 5 wheat varieties from the AFC program. But I think in a couple of years, without changes, it's going to start to dry up.
Yeah.
You don't see the impact for a few years later just because of the way that long-term pipeline works.
Hey, Tyler, final thoughts.
Yeah, it's important to understand that Ag Canada is still in the wheat breeding game, but it has pulled out of others, right? Like, this is not some false emergency that's kind of made up in our minds. If you look at the footprint that Ag Canada's got, it is shrinking. We know that happens, and we think that the VUA is a small step forward to a more sustainable future for plant breeding in Canada.
Well, fascinating discussion. I really want to hear from the audience. What are your thoughts? Good, bad? Maybe you're in the middle on this one. Maybe there's some points that weren't made by our two guests. I would love to hear from you. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Not just problems, also solutions, everybody. Remember that. Hey, Tyler and Lauren, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.
Absolutely.